50 to 60 minutes. And then at the end, I would be happy to answer any questions. So if you would hold your questions to the end, that helps me a lot. On Zoom, it's a little difficult to field them as we go along. And at the end, I'd be glad to pick them up. So if you will bear with me, I am going to pull up my slideshow. Okay, so you should see a slide there with a sow, a mother, and two cubs. It's a nice reminder that bears are coming out at this point. I'm going to talk about that when we talk about the life history during the year of bears. But really the first thing I want to do is set the stage for why we are talking about bear awareness so much these days. Two reasons. Number one, we have more bears, way more bears, in many more places than we have had in more than a century. You think back just 10 years ago, if I was going to go up to Glacier Park or down to Yellowstone Park, or I was going to go into the Bob Marshall Wilderness, well, I knew that I had to implement all of the bear safety protocols. But I wouldn't have done that 10 years ago if I was going to be up in the Tobacco Root Range, for example, or the Big Belts or the Little Belts. That has changed. And what we're saying these days, in terms of a good safety rule, in other words, to play it safe, is that we should all, if we're going to be in the field anywhere west of Billings, implement the bear safety protocols. And not just in the mountains or in the forests, but even in the open areas, prairie areas, in that western part of the state. So I'm going to explain why that's the case. Back in the early 70s, the federal government put the grizzly in the lower 48 states on the threatened list under the Endangered Species Act. As you may know, there are actually two lists under the Endangered Species Act for protecting species. The endangered list for those species that are on the brink, and then the threatened list for those that are in trouble but not so much. So in the lower 48 states, the federal government put the grizzly on the threatened species list. That kicked in protections and what we call a recovery program, meaning that federal government, the states, and others were going to work together to recover, bring back that species. So one of the things they did early in the process, decades ago, was draw on the map recovery zones. In other words, places in this part of the country where they thought we still had some grizzlies. And I'm going to focus now on this map and indicate the three recovery zones that we have now in Montana. So if you take a look up in the northwest portion of the state, you've got the Cabinet Yaak population. That's the smallest population of grizzlies in Montana right now. So it's west of Libby in the Cabinet Mountains, and then up towards the Canadian border in the Yaak River Valley. So we're talking about maybe 60 or 70 grizzlies in that area. Another recovery zone that is partly in Montana is the Greater Yellowstone Recovery Zone. So Yellowstone Park, and then on the Montana side, it picks up some of our mountain ranges, the Absarokas, the Beartooths, the Gallatins, and the Madisons. And that area has maybe somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 grizzlies. Then up closer to where we live here in Helena is the Northern Continental Divide grizzly population, sometimes called the NCDE. And it extends from the Canadian border in Glacier Park, picks up the North Fork of the Flathead, comes down, picks up the Swan Valley, the Mission Wilderness and Rattlesnake Wilderness, and then the Bob Marshall, Great Bear, and Scapegoat Wilderness. In fact, it comes down almost to Lincoln and right above the Blackfoot River. That is the largest grizzly population in Montana and the largest in the lower 48 states. Somewhere around 1,000 grizz. So here's what's happening. Grizzlies don't like to be crowded. They're big animals, and now that we have these historically large populations, we have not seen anything like this for more than a century. Some of them are getting crowded and they start to expand their range, meaning that they start to leave and move out looking for other places to live. So these light colored areas, kind of a light blue, indicate where the grizzlies are coming out of these recovery zones and moving out. So if we take a look at that Northern Continental Divide population, we've got a lot of them coming south along the Continental Divide, way down towards Butte, Boulder, that area, into the Big Belts. They're also moving out east across the Rocky Mountain front, across I-15, and actually there was one sighted out near Big Sandy a year or so ago. And the greater Yellowstone population is moving out as well. So essentially, we are, on the one hand, we've got very healthy black bear populations. We've got black bear just about anywhere you might find forest in Montana. And then on top of that, we have these historically large grizzly populations extending into places where they haven't been in my lifetime, my grandparents' lifetime. They're moving back out onto the plains, and they are now, some of them, a few, are actually living year-round on the prairie. So, excuse me. So you get the idea. We now have bears at higher levels than we've had in many decades, and we're seeing them in places where we didn't used to see them. So we're finding that if we're going to hike or camp or picnic or fish or hunt, or frankly, even go stay in a cabin in some of these areas, we need to be ready for the possible presence of grizz and black bears. So let's talk about some of the universal messages about bear safety. The first one is, within this part of the state, the western half of Montana, bears can be anywhere. Definitely in the backcountry, but also in what we call the front country, around cabins, around resorts, around marinas, farms, and ranches. And when we talk about how to deal with bear encounters, and we're going to get into detail on that later, we're going to focus on the bear's behavior and not so much on their species. And finally, it's a lot easier to avoid conflict than it is to deal with one. And so what I'm going to talk about next is how to avoid encountering bears. So to do that, we need some understanding of their life history. One of the things we think about is there are some differences in the species. Either species can be dangerous, but there are some differences. Black bears have typically been a forest species. So they are a little bit less confrontational than grizzlies. They can be dangerous, no question. They are wonderful climbers. They are wary of people, but they have some ability to live around people. You know, you may have had the same experience that I have, that in campground settings, it's fairly common to bump into black bears. Grizzlies, a little bit different. They've been a forest and a prairie animal, and that evolutionary history in open areas on prairies, as you may know, historically, there used to be grizz way out in what we now call eastern Montana, and in fact, all the way out across the Dakotas. If you ever look at the map of where grizzlies used to be before European contact, they were in the Dakotas, Nebraska, parts of Kansas, and a little bit of Texas and Oklahoma. That's amazing to us, but that's a reminder that when Lewis and Clark were coming up the Missouri River, they were bumping into grizz way, way out on the plains, hundreds of miles from forests or mountains. Grizz are a little bit more likely to confront a threat. If you encounter a grizz, it may be more likely to follow through and deal with you, whereas a black bear might be more likely to back off. And grizz are the ones that do a lot of digging. We're going to talk about some of the things they eat later. For example, they will dig a lot looking for roots or looking for rodents. And they are less likely to be seen in populated areas, although more and more they are being seen around towns, farms, ranches, and that type of thing. So another way to be safe is to consider the day cycle for your typical bear. There are times when they are likely to be out and about, and that is nighttime, dawn, and dusk. They are at an advantage at that time because they have extremely keen senses. They can navigate pretty well in the dark. We are at an extreme disadvantage. And as we talk about later, we do not want to be out in the field in the dark or low light conditions. And of course, during the day, sows that have cubs, they're going to be sticking together and they're out and about. And another thing to remember is that because bears often are moving around at night, during the middle of the day, they often bed down somewhere. So from a safety standpoint, it's important for us to know that in the heat of the day, we've got to be careful that we don't go stumble upon a bear bed. You know, people have actually stepped on bears, which is not a pleasant experience. And finally, their senses are very acute. Their senses of smell are incredibly sensitive, but their eyes and their ears are also good. They frankly have better senses than we do. Yearly cycles at this time of year, as you may have heard on the news, they are starting to come out of their dens, and that will continue over the next few weeks. During the summer, they're ranging all over the place. In the fall, they go into a phase called hyperphagia, which means eating a whole lot. They're basically bulking up before they go into the den for the winter. So sometime around Thanksgiving into early December, that's when they're going to den. So one of the ways we keep safe is that we keep alert for things that we can see that may tell us that bears are around. So we're going to take a look at some of these signs. I hope you can see these, but excuse me. One of the photographs shows a log that has been torn apart. Bears will tear apart logs looking for bugs. Bugs are one of the things they really enjoy eating. The thing about bugs for them is that it's a very easy food source. You tear apart a log, you flip over a rock, they can harvest a lot of bugs. So we keep an eye out for logs that have been torn up, rocks that have been flipped over, or areas where they have dug up caches of various kinds of food that other animals have left. Another photograph there shows a bear bed. It's basically an area where you can see that the vegetation has been pounded down by a really big animal lying there. And there's a whole lot of bear scat. So we see that kind of a thing. It tells us bears may be present. It also tells us that a bear may return to that place. So these are all signs when we see them that tell us to be incredibly careful. You know, when I see things like this, I get my bear spray out. I tell everybody in my group that there may be bears in the area. You've probably seen where bears will rub their backs against trees. That sometimes will leave pieces of their fur on the tree. A couple years ago in Yellowstone, my wife and I saw a tree with patches of fur on it. So we got careful. We were watching for bear, and about 5 minutes later, we saw them. They also will claw high on a tree. If those are fresh marks, that can tell us that bears may be present. And grizz, as we mentioned, will dig. And again, what I mentioned was that they're looking for roots or rodents, other animals that might be below the surface. So if we see an area that's been dug up by something really big recently, so the dirt's going to be very dark, again, that's another warning that bears may be available. We need to be really careful. And we need to understand and keep in mind that bears are omnivores, as you probably know. They eat almost anything. You would be surprised what they eat. So during a year, they are seeking out all kinds of things to eat. You know, there are certain animals that eat just a few things. Bears will eat, as this indicates, hundreds of different types of things. They are opportunists, meaning that they seek out new opportunities. I used to have a dog like that. I had a dog that would put things in his mouth and figure out whether it was edible or not. That is literally what bears do. If you're familiar with chainsaws, you know, you got to put bar oil on a chainsaw. Some loggers had been working up in British Columbia. They set their chainsaw and their bar oil aside. They went over here and had lunch. When they came back, a grizz had punctured the bottle with the bar oil and was lapping it up like it was olive oil. They seek things out and eat it. On farms north of us along the Rocky Mountain front, bears have gotten into sheds and they have found big containers of herbicide and pesticide and fertilizer. You know, they have no idea what it is. It smells interesting. They get into it and the result is pretty serious. So we need to understand that bears are going to be eating all kinds of things. And from a safety standpoint, that means we have to anticipate places that might be attractive to them. And after they eat, of course, they're going to excrete, and their scat, if it's fresh, can be another warning sign that they are nearby. And scat's going to look different, as you probably know, depending upon what time of year it is. You know, on the west side of the divide, in August and September, scat from bears is often going to be a crazy purple color because they have been eating huckleberries. So again, big scat like this that is fresh, that tells us we need to be careful because they may be very close by. We get our bear spray out and we get prepared. And they are often around kill sites where there's any kind of a carcass of an animal. Maybe it's an animal that was already dead and they're scavenging, or maybe it's one they killed. But they very likely will treat it as their site, their food source, and will defend it. So a very good thing to do is to avoid any kill site because we don't want to be there when they come back. A couple of years ago, some hunters were down in the gravelly range. They saw a grizz in a situation like this photograph, a grizzly with a carcass of an elk. Why these guys yelled at the bear, I don't know, but they did. Very bad idea. The bear sits up and thinks that these guys are challenging the bear for the food and charged. So, moral of the story is, if there's any kind of a kill site, avoid it. Stay away, do not get close. And bear tracks, if you are lucky enough to see a good print of a bear's foot in the mud or in the snow, if it's fresh, obviously that can warn you that they may be around. Distinguishing black bear and grizzly tracks is kind of a subtle thing. But the thing that's easiest to look at is where the claw marks are. As you'll see from this illustration, The claw marks on a black bear track are much closer to the toes. The claw marks on a grizzly bear track are much farther from the toes. And that's because the claws on a black bear are much smaller than the grizz claws. But I don't care what kind of bear it is. If I see a fresh bear print, I get really careful. So we've talked about how to avoid bear encounters. Now we're going to transition a little bit, and we're going to talk about not attracting bears. We don't want to attract bears to our campsite. We don't want to attract them to our picnic area, and we don't want to attract them to any cabin we're staying in. So as we mentioned earlier, bears are opportunists, they're omnivores, they're looking for just about anything that's interesting. So they are curious and they use their noses. They navigate with their noses, following smells, and then they investigate. So basically what we're talking about is smellies. Anything smelly, and I mean anything, can attract a bear. So these are some of the things we think about and that we have to be very careful about. Any and all kinds of toiletries, soaps, sunscreen, lip balm, bug repellent, toothpaste, toothbrushes, dental floss, candles, food, drink, pet food, dirty dishwater. Dirty dishwater is like soup for a bear. And let me just take a side note here. If we've got dirty dishwater and we're in your typical campground, you want to pour it down the toilet. That takes the smell away. If you're in the backcountry, you don't have a toilet, you want to walk a long distance away from your camp and broadcast it into the bushes. That's all you can do. The other thing to keep in mind is that if you're cooking around a camp stove or a campfire, you may get food on your clothes or on your hands or your face. You want to wash your hands and face, change your clothes before you get into a tent. You don't want to smell like, for example, spaghetti sauce when you climb into your sleeping bag. Garbage, they love garbage. Recyclables, fishing gear is going to smell like fish. Fish entrails. If you go fishing, you catch a fish, you want to keep it, you clean it at the stream or at the lake. Take the entrails, puncture the swim bladder, throw them into the water. You don't want to clean your fish at a picnic table. You may have heard about 3 years ago, I think it was in the Many Glacier area. There were some car campers and they caught a fish and they took it to their campsite and they cleaned the fish at their picnic table. Bad idea, because a grizz smelled that, made a beeline for that campsite, scattered everybody, and they had to close the camp. My wife and I were camping over at Kindla Lake, if you know where that is, on the west side of the park. And we were at a campsite, a car camp, and we saw some people cleaning a fish on a picnic table, spreading blood, scales, and fish smell all over the place. We packed up at 8 o'clock that night and left because that's unbelievably dangerous. So here's the problem. If all of these smelly things could attract a bear, then we've got to secure these smelly things, keep them away from bears when we are away from the camp or we're in the sleeping bag at night. And depending upon where we are, we're going to have various options. Here's a camp that is a real problem. They've left out fishing gear, that smells, a barbecue, that smells, pet food dish, and paper plates. Some people assume that if they burn their paper plates in the campfire, the smell is gone. The scientists say that's not true, that it's better to take your paper plates, put them in a plastic bag, and secure them somewhere. So if you're in a car campground and you've got a hard-sided vehicle, like the trunk of a car or a secure place on a pickup, or in a hard-sided RV, that's where you want to put your food and anything else smelling. In some of the camps, in Yellowstone or the national forests around Yellowstone, they actually have lockers in the campgrounds. I mean, you may have seen those. So you can put your smelly stuff in there. But if you don't have a car or an RV or a truck, then you have to look for other options. And there are on the market various kinds of certified bear-resistant containers. These are things that are designed to keep bears out and have been tested with grizzlies. There are lots of certified bear-resistant coolers on the market. My wife and I mortgaged the house and we bought one. They're very expensive, but we bought one. It was great, but they didn't tell us when we bought it that you have to secure it in a special way. There's a photograph there that shows a padlock. There are holes at the two corners. When you go to bed at night or you leave the camp during the day, you have to put padlocks in those holes or a bolt in a nut. If you don't do it, it's not bear resistant. So get the word out on that. A lot of people have these really fancy coolers, but they don't realize that you have to put a padlock or a bolt on those holes. And then backpackers will use something like that black container there. Bear barrels, bear kegs. You know, they don't have anything else. They can't carry a cooler. So I've used these for 25 years. We put everything in there at night. Food, coffee, toothpaste, garbage, anything. So I was talking about bear-resistant containers. This is the symbol that you want to look for to see what bear-resistant containers are. There are a lot of them on the market. I've seen them occasionally at Costco, every hardware store and outdoor store that I can think of. They're good, but you have to use them the way they tell you. For some backpackers and hunters, they don't have any of those options. So the only thing they can do is hang their smelly stuff up in a tree. If you're lucky, there will be a bear pole set up like this. If not, you have to find a tree with a limb that is high enough. You have to get it at least 10 feet off the ground, at least 4 feet out off the limb. For obvious reasons, black bears and a few grizz can climb. You don't want them reaching out and getting it. So you get the idea. If you're camping, picnicking, whatever, and you're going to be going to bed at night or leaving the site, you've got to secure all the smelly stuff. If you don't, you may end up in tomorrow's news report. Because every summer we get news reports out of Glacier and Yellowstone saying somebody left a cooler out there and it was open, or somebody left their barbecue out there with smells and a bear came in and scattered everybody. We don't want to be that person. So we're going to anticipate these things ahead of time. And when people camp, it's important not to camp in a place where there might be bears. If we see a route where there are bear tracks, we don't want to camp there. We don't want to camp in the middle of huckleberry bushes or chokecherry bushes because they will frequent those places looking for berries. We don't want to be there. Not too close to streams. They use streams as highways. That's a thing that we don't always remember. I don't walk up and down streams, but they do. It's easy for them. They'll just walk right up a stream. So you don't want to have your camp too close to the stream. And when people set up their camps in the backcountry where they've got some ability to locate things, it's a good idea to locate your sleeping area separate from your cooking area, separate from your storage area. We call this the Bermuda Triangle. It's the way to remember it. You know, you don't want to be sleeping close to where you were eating or close to where your food and other smelly things are hung. So I think you see what we're saying. We're talking about avoiding attracting bears, whether we're fishing, camping, picnicking, or even staying in a cabin. Some people, when they go and stay at a cabin, they'll throw a lot of their gear outside overnight. They'll put a cooler outside. They might have things out on a picnic table. They might have their fishing gear there. Those things can attract a bear to a cabin. But now we're going to talk about encounters. If we've tried everything, but we still have an encounter with a bear, how do we deal with it? Number one, stay alert. We've been talking about things that you can see that will tell you they are there. Travel in a group. This is very, very important. And the data tells us that almost all of the bear attacks involve a person traveling solo, occasionally two people. But three people or more, almost never. So when you go into Yellowstone Park these days, they hand you a little postcard that has some rules on it. And one of them is, when you're out hiking in Yellowstone, stick in a group of three or more. Because we know that if a bear sees a group of three or more people, the bear usually backs off. And if you're going to go into an area where you can't see very well, if you're out walking and you're going to walk into the woods or into an area with a lot of bushes or high grass, stop and yell. Give them a chance to move out of the way. 9 times out of 10, if they hear you and have enough space, they will move out of the way. Most of the time, they have no interest at all in seeing us. They want to move out of the way. And finally, we're going to talk a lot about bear spray, but the thing I want to say now is have it handy. Very often down in Yellowstone Park, we see people who have bear spray, but it's way on the back of their backpack. Not a good idea, because when you get into a frightening encounter with a bear, your hand does not normally go like that. When you get into a frightening situation, your hand goes like this or like that. So you want to carry your bear spray in your hand, on your hip, or on your chest. And finally, as we said before, don't wander around at dark or when the sun is just coming up or it's just coming down. And if you have an encounter, your behavior matters. We're going to learn how to read their behavior, but they are reading you as well. And you can do things that can calm them down, and you can also do things that can rile them up. But never, ever run away under any circumstances. When you run, they are predators, they have a reflex, and they will chase, and they will catch anybody. So when you're out hiking in Yellowstone, for example, and you're with somebody who might run, if you encounter a bear, grab that person by the wrist. Don't let them run. At the same time, don't get closer. If you're a photographer and you see a bear, you might want to get close, get a picture. Not a good idea, because that can rile them up. And different situations call for different response. We're going to look at some scenarios. We're going to start with the most common, and we're going to move up to the most unusual. This is most common. We've all done it. You see a bear at a distance, like the one in this photo. It doesn't hear us. It doesn't smell us. It doesn't see us. It has no idea we're there. This bear is doing something else. It looks like it's rummaging on the ground for bugs. So if the bear doesn't know you're there, the smart thing to do is back off. Don't run. Keep an eye on the bear, but get your group together and go away. That makes a lot of sense. If it's not engaged with you, don't engage it. But sometimes they do know you're there. They've heard you, smelled you, seen you. Sometimes, as we will show a picture later on, sometimes they will stand up. That's not a bad thing. When they stand up, they're trying to get a better read on you. But in this case, you want to stop, get your bear spray out, and see what happens next, because there are certain things that can happen. If you're lucky, the bear will disengage. I've had this happen up in Canada. We let our guard down and we didn't make noise in a forest. We came around the corner. There was a bear. It looked right at us. And then it turned its back on us. When it does that, turns its back on you, turns away, starts eating, walks away, runs away, that's good. If they disengage from you, that's a good thing. Sometimes it's because they're feeling submissive. Sometimes they just aren't interested. Sometimes they would rather do something else. So if they disengage, don't engage it. Find a way to move away as well. However, there are two remaining possibilities that are dangerous, and they are different, and we're going to look at it. So sometimes a bear will act defensively. They will get really agitated, and that's because we've gotten too close to them. We've surprised them, for example, or maybe we've gotten between a sow and the cubs. We've surprised them. Maybe we've gotten close to their food source. Whatever, we've done something wrong, and they feel threatened. And the thing about it is, they show you that they feel threatened. They open their mouths wide. This is not a sleepy bear. This is a bear showing you that it is upset. That's one of the things they do. They leave their mouths open. So if you see a bear doing that, you don't go, oh man, that's cute. You say, well, we've got a problem. And they get agitated. They communicate to you that they are unhappy about your presence. Their ears go back, their fur is up, the mouth is open. You'll see slobber on their mouth because they produce too much spit when they're frightened. And they'll wag their heads back and forth. They'll slap the ground. They'll make very strange sounds. They'll kind of moan or woof. They'll pop their jaws. They'll clack their teeth. If you've ever experienced it, it is crystal clear what they're telling you. They're saying, hey, you have gotten way too close. I don't like it. Here's the ears are back, the fur is up, the mouth is open, you can see the slobber. The thing that we're worried about is they may decide to charge you. And if they do, we don't know if they're going to come up and stop or come up and go off to the side or whether they're going to knock us down. So you stand your ground. You do not run, and you get your bear spray out. We're going to talk a little bit later about how to use it. But bear spray is the best way to stop a charging bear. If you can't stop it, either you don't have bear spray or it doesn't work or whatever, if that bear is going to touch you and it's agitated, you throw yourself on the ground. Throw yourself on the ground, face down, cover your neck, keep your legs out, stay down. The research indicates that this is how you survive. I mean, essentially what I think is happening is you're showing the bear that you are not a threat. You go face down on the ground, you stay down until they leave. Okay, here's another possibility where a bear is going to approach you but act very, very differently. You've probably had this happen in campgrounds, and it's often a black bear. They will approach you very differently. They will be as calm as can be, quiet, not agitated at all. Their ears are forward, their mouths are closed, no slobber, they're quiet. They just walk right up to you. I've had it happen in campgrounds when I've been making breakfast, and they come right at me. And the reason they're doing it is they want something we've got. They're not frightened. They're not surprised. They're not feeling threatened at all. They're coming up to you because you've got food or they think you've got food. So it's completely different. But the protocol is somewhat the same. Don't run. Use your bear spray. But there are other things you also do. You scare them off. You wave your arms, clap your hands, yell, stomp your feet. If it comes closer, you throw stuff. And if it tries to touch you, you fight back. You do not go down on the ground. Bear spray always works whenever a bear comes close to you. Again, With this bear, if it's acting calm, use your bear spray. If it's going to touch you, fight back. Same thing if a bear is going to reach into your tent. If it's reaching into your tent, it does not feel threatened or surprised. It's reaching in because it smells something good. That's why we take our bear spray into the tent so that we can spray the tent, spray the bear. Dogs. I've spent a lot of time with dogs in the backcountry. My dog is always on a leash. My wife encountered a bear, two bears, where she had a dog on a leash. She was very fortunate to have the dog on a leash because that dog wanted to go for the bears. There are many cases where people have had dogs, the dog has run way ahead, gotten into a tussle with a bear, turned around, come running back, and where do you think they go? Right back to the owner, bringing an enraged bear with them. In some of those cases, the bear has killed the person. So the smart thing to do is, if you're out in the field in bear country, have your dog on a leash. Bear spray. Let's talk about bear spray. As I indicated, it is the best way to stop a bear that's getting too close. I don't care what the bear is doing. If it gets too close, and when I'm saying too close, I mean the length of a school bus. Everybody knows how long a school bus is. As soon as a bear is within a school bus length, we create a cloud of pepper between ourselves and the bear. Bear spray is a very strong version of pepper spray. It comes out in a fog and it goes very far. The idea is to create a cloud of nasty pepper between ourselves and the bear. So as soon as that bear is within a school bus length of me, I deploy my bear spray. I spray, I get the cloud out there. What I'm hoping is that the bear will run into the cloud, gets into their eyes, nose, and mouth. It's incredibly painful. It can blind them for half an hour. It can make it very difficult for them to breathe. So that's the way it works. Bear spray basically renders them incapable for a certain period of time and allows you to back off. And again, it's not that difficult. You get the bear spray out between yourself and the bear as it approaches. There are maybe 5 or 6 different brands that I've seen here in Montana. They're all pretty much the same. There's a loop that you put your finger through. There's a safety on the top of the can. It's a plastic thing, orange. You got to get your thumb in front of that, pull it back and off. That exposes a lever that you push down and the spray comes out. And since the bear is coming at you on all 4, you want to aim down just a little bit. And you make that cloud between yourself and the bear. These cans, depending upon the size and the manufacturer, have anywhere from about 5 seconds to 8 seconds of spray. You probably don't want to empty it all at one time. I'd say maybe 3 or 4 seconds, and then maybe do it again if you have to. You basically get it out. So finally, let me just say one more thing about bear spray. Studies have been done in the US and Canada concerning the effectiveness of bear spray. And number one, everyone who has used bear spray has survived. Number two, very rarely do they ever get hurt. It is very effective on the bear, as I indicated. If they can't see and they're having difficulty breathing, they really can't come and hurt you. The other thing about bear spray is you don't have to be accurate. You can be shaking like a leaf, and believe me, you will be. If you get the bear spray out there, it really doesn't matter if you're shaking. If you get the cloud out there between yourself and the bear, that's how it works. So as I said earlier, in terms of safety, we're going to implement these safety requirements that we talked about, regardless of whether it's a grizz or a black bear. because either of these species can and will hurt people. But just in terms of interest, you probably know that there are certain indicators, if you're able to see them, that can tell you whether it's a black bear or a grizz. The problem is that in the field, it may be difficult. Often in the field, I get out there and I have a heck of a time figuring out what kind of bear I'm seeing. When my wife and I were in Yellowstone 2 years ago, we saw a bear across the river. And from a distance, we thought it was a grizz. It had a real silver tip color, almost blonde. But by the time we got our binoculars out and we started looking more carefully, it became very obvious that it was in fact a black bear. That's something a lot of people don't know. Black bears aren't necessarily black. They range from jet black to blonde, and grizz can go from the classic silver tip color all the way to a very dark brown. So we don't pay any attention to the color when we're trying to figure out what kind of bear it is. We also don't pay any attention to size. Yeah, definitely, grizz tend to be much larger. But in the field, we don't know whether we're looking at a very young grizz or a very old black bear. So we don't make our decision based upon size. And the scat, there's really no particular difference, so that's not going to help us. So the thing that we are most likely to be able to see in the field is the shoulder profile. And that requires that the bear be standing sideways to us, as those photographs indicate, and be standing pretty much on all four like that. If you see a bear standing like that and you look at the shoulder profile, you look for a hump. If the animal has a definite shoulder hump, that's grizz. If it does not have a shoulder hump, but the rump is very large and prominent, that's a black bear. So when we teach this to school kids here, we say it's hump versus rump. And believe me, the kids love that. That's something they can remember. But that is typically the only thing you're going to be able to see. If you're lucky, you may get a good look at the head. The head on a black bear tends to be pointed, almost conical, and their ears are taller and more pointed. On a grizzly, their faces, if you look head on, are extremely round, and from the side, they're kind of foreshortened or dished. Their ears are shorter and more rounded. And then I am going to mention claw size and shape. I hope you never get close enough to see that. But if you can see there, I know the video screen on the side kind of blocks out a part of the black bear claw. Black bear claws are shorter and more hooked. Grizzly claws are considerably longer and not quite as hooked. So that's the basic difference. Anyway, we want to thank all these organizations that allowed us to use their photographs. That's the end of my slideshow. I would be happy to field any questions. So fire away.